You know, of course, I am incredibly honored to deliver the fourth Forrest Church lecture, but it's a harrowing sort of honor. There are simply too many thinkers I admire at Union, making too much good trouble, and I cannot begin to do justice to all the ways justice has been practiced in this community. Much of the theological work of social ethics, of gender, sex, race, and religious difference happens because of what has happened here at Union. One is stretched wide as the planet, to embrace this diversity, and yet each voice demands the singularity of a particular perspective, and no one has made this demand more brilliantly and world-shiftingly clear. No one has further advanced the theology of a particularizing justice in the honesty of its deep historical context than James Cone. Differences cannot be washed out in some pale universalism. All the more harrowing. This is, after all, a lectureship that honors universalism. But as I understand it, the Unitarian Universalism of Forrest Church does not pale before the multiplicity of divergent perspectives. In his last book, as Carolyn read to us so beautifully and across such a stunning set of contexts, Forrest Church had offered the beautiful metaphor of the cathedral of the world, a space of multiple colorful windows through which is filtered the one light, unknowable in itself. Destination unknown. Still, between a cathedral-esque universalism and a cross-bearing particularism, I was thinking, woe is me. But fortunately, this very tension opens the window of tonight's declared topic. Planetary entanglement can serve as the mediating notion. I mean by it the social ecology of the Earth, where our singularities come precariously interlinked in a universe, not an abstract universal, of difference. This sociality is not the familiar anthropocentric creation of our various traditions, nor is it an apolitical so-called nature or an inhuman post-humanity. We have to do with a possible cosmopolitics of the planet. So let me say up front, in contemplating the ecological situation of the Earth, our other differences do not pale in significance. We do not now paint all of our issues green. Instead, in facing our collective planetary situation, our diversities may find a common ground. But that ground, which is the Earth itself, is exhibiting uncommonly intense symptoms of violation. The Unitarian Universalist statement of conscience on the threat of climate change put it perfectly 8 years ago, and I can say perfectly because I'm not a UU. It says, Earth is our home. We are part of this world, and its destiny is our own. Life on this planet will be gravely affected unless we embrace new practices, ethics, and values to guide our lives on a warming planet. After nicely summing up the science, now so familiar, the burning of the fossil fuels, oil, and natural gas releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which traps more solar heat and causes the atmosphere to warm, and so the polar ice and glaciers to melt, etc., etc. And it continues, entire cultures, nations, and life forms are at risk of extinction, while basic human rights to adequate supplies of food, fresh water, and health, as well as sustainable livelihoods for humans, are being undermined. Both our consumption and our disposal burden the interdependent web of existence. To sustain the interdependent web, we must burden it less while maintaining the essentials of our lives. Hurricanes Katrina and Rita are painful omens of how racism, sexism, and poverty worsen the effects of global warming or climate change. And then the statement calls for due mitigations. This 2006 statement brings us within shooting distance of the present. But in the intervening years, we have not pulled back from the apocalyptic brink signified by 2 degrees centigrade of warming. 2013 saw the record-breaking carbon dioxide emission of 40 billion tons, these numbers. And we note a certain shift in environmentalist language. But before we consider the precarious condition of our interdependent web, I want to take a trip back into the past of our cosmopolitics, way back. I hope that by complicating our narratives of context, we may address what I will call, at least for tonight, our Gaia Complex. On a recent stopover in Berlin, Jason and I had the pleasure of visiting the Pergamon Museum. It was built a century ago to house the monumental Near Eastern acquisitions of German archaeology. It was a last-minute detour, so I was not prepared for the scale of the reconstructed Pergamon altar, rising nearly 3 stories high, nor of its bas-relief, a frieze that runs the size of a city block. I was just an awestruck tourist listening on headphones to a narrative of this remainder of a colonial Greek city on the coast of Asia Minor, allied with a then emergent Roman Empire. It was built 170 years before the Christian era. I really didn't know anything about it, beyond the faintly menacing echo of Revelation 2:12, an address to the angel of the church in Pergamon. This might have forewarned me. With Athenian sophistication, the sculpture celebrates the great victory of the city over its enemies. No. There it is, thanks. One particular, and there are only 2 of them, so I don't get distracted. One particularly dynamic composition rivets the gaze. Amidst a flutter of wings, a slither of serpents, and a tangle of bodies, a naked youth writhes in defeat. Athena herself has grabbed him by his curly locks and is about to strike him dead. On her left, another female figure rises out of the ground. Her face depicts anguish. The narrator explains that this is Gaia, the earth, desperately pleading for the life of her child, Alcyoneus. He strains to touch her. She reaches toward him, but Athena has broken his contact with Gaia. Therefore, he embodies, the narrator clarified, the doom of all the children of the earth. The frieze celebrates Pergamon's victory in the guise of these vanquished children of Gaia over the Galatian tribes, the barbarians long obstructive to the expanding Greco-Roman order. My relaxed holiday gaze froze into focus. What, already? So it was this explicit over 2,000 years ago, this breach from the earth? It's not that the Athenians were directly targeting Mother Earth, Gaia. No more do we now. Their foes were the migrant interlopers who resisted and threatened their world order. Gaia just gets in the way. And Athena, the supreme daddy's girl, ignores her. Earth's devastation is collateral damage. It would seem that we have here to do with an ancient complex. So what if we let Pergamon stand as a metaphor of the particularly classical formation of the polis, the city, civis, of our so-called civilization? Let it symbolize the Western context of a complex in which I know myself, indeed theology knows itself, deeply implicated. And in its complicated Athenian legacy of slavery, philosophy, democracy, it forms the matrix for the much later dominion of the Christian empires and of a spatio-temporality that has enfolded the globe. Any Earth-identified populations, sedentary or nomadic, are marked as its barbarians. They are uncivilized, another kind, another race, fit either for subjugation or elimination. And the non-humans, of course, are all fair game. In the self-assertion of this civilization, something, though, remains unconscious. Not the polis, which stays very conscious, sometimes as sheer assertion, sometimes self-critically. It would seem instead that it was oikos, home, the ecological ground of the city that went underground. Relation to the earth home is sacrificed on the altar of civilization, driven into the civilizational unconscious. Friedrich Jameson's notion of the political unconscious, as he reads the cultural logic of late capitalism, is relevant. It is an unconscious produced by, he says, the ruses of repressive power. So might we diagnose here a Gaia complex? It lends a face to a diffuse fear of the non-human world from which the human remains non-separable. Call it an ecophobia. And what does the mythological war of Pergamon against barbarians, and so against the Earth Mother herself, become in our time but the logic of late capitalism? So then might we recognize the major planetary symptom now of the Gaia complex as climate change? If so, the ruse by which our polis represses its own cosmos may be most legible in the form of what's called climate change denial, that potent syndrome concocted of neoliberal capitalism and reactionary Christianity. This denial, because it is a complex, it can't be cured by the facts. The facts are clear. They keep materializing. The predictions fulfilled, the tipping points in evidence, the solemn series of melting glaciers, deepening droughts, widening deserts, intensifying floods, raging fires, the toxification of the seas, and the mounting parts per million of CO2, and I don't think I'm going to add the snowstorms. It's just winter. But all this climate change in flagrante does not close the gap of the climate change denial. So for tonight, let the gap between the marble hands of doomed Alcyonius and of frantic Gaia signify our civilizational dissociation. We know well, vis-a-vis our species' future, the affect of helpless despair, don't we? So let's consider then the possibility of getting back in touch. Not of going back, and certainly not to a tender Mother Earth tended by harmonious natives, all of which never exactly existed. We might instead engage the open system of systems poised at the edge of chaos that is the subject of the ecological Gaia hypothesis. We might do that theologically. But speaking theologically, let's tarry a moment longer with the original Gaia. In a startling synchronicity, I learned about the layered history of the Pergamon altar from, of all things, a recent commentary on a Pauline epistle by your very own Professor Brigitte Kahl. In Galatians Reimagined, she follows the tracks of those Galatians to whom Paul wrote in the 1st century of the Christian era. They were residents of the Roman province of Galatia in Asia Minor, and their direct ancestors were none other than the defeated Galatians of Pergamon. At the time of Paul, they still carried the onus, writes Professor Kahl, of a particularly hostile race who, after 5 centuries of godless and irrational onslaughts against the sacred shrines and foundations of Greco-Roman civilization, had at last been subdued and assigned their place within the God-willed system of worldwide Roman rule. These Eastern Galatians were then actually Celtic migrants from Northern Europe. Roman authors frequently use, I learned, the Latin term terror with reference to Galatians and the other Celts the Gauls. Julius Caesar's Gallic War was, she says, part of an ongoing multi-stage Greco-Roman campaign against a Galatian global terrorism. Call argues that the global claim of Roman power required the construction of a worldwide terrorist enemy, the metus Gallicus. And she does solicit uncanny resonances with our own recent history. As she writes, we have now entered into a new era of worldwide crusading against terror. These historical precedents are chilling reminders of an unresolved past. In other words, Western Islamophobia is preceded here by an older Celtophobia. And Roman accounts of the scary power of these primal barbarians with their blonde dreadlocks, thickened like horsetails, we read, exposes the versatile racialization of enmity. And then Dr. Call observes the very panel we are considering. You can find it photographed in her book. Holding to her doomed child with the deadly wound between his ribs, the earth goddess appears as an ancient pietà. Gaia embodies a wrenching act of grief. Gaia, she says, is the only deity of the whole Pergamene pantheon who displays the vulnerability of love. None of the fighting gods and goddesses above, trapped in their own confrontation with the deadly enemy other, can show mercy to Gaia, for the battle of civilization must go on. And so it has. The sculptor captured the petrified hopelessness that ties both winners and losers together. The shadow side, perhaps, of our inescapable human entanglement. Call's book interprets the letter to the Galatians, and she finds in its critique of the works of the law a coded challenge to the sacred law, not as assumed of the Jews, but actually of Roman rule primarily. And she adds another twist. She interprets Paul's theology as also messianically gifted with a profoundly ecological dimension. When Paul transmits the moans of the earth in the birth pangs of a new creation, we hear new valencies. His Galatians live in the aftermath of an assault on the womb of their earth, their world. Reading with the eyes of the vanquished, Call's eco-hermeneutics helps us to encounter at the source helps us to counter at the source an anti-environmental Christianity dominated by a different Paul, the supersessionist, misogynist, flesh-hating one. A new story of Gaia is being narrated in our epoch. Not a heroic struggle of the progress of civilization versus nature and her barbaric holdouts. Also not a story of timely turnabout and cozy enfoldment in the waiting arms of Mother Earth. In The Vanishing Face of Gaia, a final reflection, the 80-year-old James Lovelock refers to the most famous of all photographs, you know, the one of the Earth snapped from outer space in 1972. That icon, he writes, is undergoing subtle changes as the white ice fades away. The green of forest and grassland fades into the dun of desert, and the oceans lose their blue-green hue and turn a purer swimming pool blue as they too become desert. Along with the biologist Lynn Margulis, the chemist Lovelock had formulated the Gaia hypothesis 3 decades earlier. He thanks his neighbor, the poet William Golding, for suggesting the metaphor of Gaia as an alternative to his own somewhat less catchy nomenclature, a universal biocybernetic system with the tendency to homeostasis. Wouldn't have sold us well. Gaia names then for him the living planet, his words, the living planet that we inhabit and are a part of. This earth is no longer the ball of rock that life happens on the surface of. It's a complex system enfolding in its animate process all the interdependent agencies, including us, who together compose the planet. The theory was, of course, at first shunned by the science establishment. But it appears ever less controversial in the light not only of anthropogenic climate change, but of the science of emergence, which, as Philip Clayton writes, treats the biosphere as a series of systems within systems within systems. It is time, writes Lovelock, to wake up and realize that Gaia is no cozy mother that nurtures humans and can be propitiated by gestures such as carbon trading or sustainable development. Gaia, even though we are a part of her, will always dictate the terms of peace. He warns that what people mean by the plea to save the earth is really save the planet as we know it, and that, he says, is now impossible. The series of monumental climate events keeps unfolding, more drop, more melting, more superstorms. The leaked draft United Nations report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, now leaked just a few weeks ago, announced that another 15 years of failure to cut heat-trapping emissions would make the problem virtually impossible to solve with known technologies and thus impose enormous costs on future generations. And yet this impossibility was a mere blip on the New York Times website and hardly appeared elsewhere. The Gaia Complex has formidable soporific force. It is, in fact, Lovelock says, as though an alarm clock is sounding as we sleep. I fear, he writes, that we still dream on, and rather than waking, we weave the sound of the alarm clock into our dreams. It's quite an image. Even those who accept the science can hardly hold it in our daily consciousness. We suspect the apocalypse is perhaps propagandistically getting overstated. We tuck its alarming scenario into the category of the future, just beyond the realm of immediate concern. I have a deadline for my book and what's happening in the Ukraine. But this is no innocent ignorance, this collective dream state. The alarm has been sounding since the 70s, the 1970s, and now a whopping 97% scientific consensus has been reached, and the stupor persists. The nation's leading climatologist, James Hansen, tells of his earnest testimonies as the head of the NASA Climate Center to high-level Bush government panels. He was laying out so carefully to them the world, he writes, in which how the world in which civilization developed, the world with climate patterns that we know and stable shorelines is in imminent peril. And he soon realized that what was happening in these panels was government greenwash, expressing concern about global warming and the environment while taking no actions to actually stabilize climate or preserve the environment. The ruse of greenwashing, in other words, there's an analogy in what's called pinkwashing in terms of sexuality. The ruse of greenwashing is a device of the Gaia Complex, I would say, for keeping the public unconscious, for keeping the alarm tucked into the dream, out of touch. Hansen has since turned into a multiply arrested activist. More forthright strategies have in the interim succeeded in neutralizing the alarm almost completely. For instance, Senator Imhoff's 2012 book, The Greatest Hoax, How the Global Warming Conspiracy Threatens Your Future, manages an impressive reversal. It's not the collusion of carbon-based corporate capitalism with the political right and Dominion Christians that is the conspiracy. No, it's atheist scientists and leftists. Well, the political unconscious, according to Jameson, operates by grisly and ironic reversals. And what the deniers use is uncertainty, doubt about the facts. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's Merchants of Doubt exposes the close relation between a prior case of obscured truth, that of the medical effects of tobacco smoke, and that of global warming. A lot of the same characters are involved, in fact. The merchandising of doubt has only, they write, been able to work so well because we have an erroneous view of science. We think that science provides certainty. So if we lack certainty, we think the science must be faulty or incomplete. And this is important. There have to be multiple layers of uncertainty in climate science. We know of no more complex system than that comprised by the Earth. So the fact that science has reached consensus does not eliminate the uncertainty, the indeterminacy of processes that are calculated through probabilities, subject to empirical tests, and interpreted through ongoing collective debate and refinement. The prejudice that science provides certainty is an old one, but one most clearly articulated, they write, by the late 19th century positivists who held out a dream of positive knowledge in the familiar sense of absolutely, positively true. It's one of the reasons I'm engaging negative theology, but that's another topic. Misinformation as to the character of science itself thus enables misinformation about the climate. And despite the margins of uncertainty, we may nonetheless hear the truth of Bill McKibben's metaphor. We are running Genesis backwards, decreating. We're running Genesis backwards, decreating. McKibben's 2010 Earth, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet, seemed to me the pivotal text of a planetary transition. The unpronounceable second A, he spells Earth E-A-A-R-T-H. That second A signifies the unspeakable that yet must be said. Here's how he says it. The Earth that we knew, the only Earth that we ever knew, is gone. Among the activists who began to ply their prophetic warnings back before then, when the planet as we know it might have been saved, 30 years before, the language has shifted. It is sounding a little more like John of Patmos. Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth. It is getting late. Not that any of these activists are announcing the end of time or of the world. There is still time to wake up. This is true even for John's Apocalypse, chapter 3. Wake up and strengthen what is at the point of death, he writes. Well, what's at the point of death is not the earth, is not the world, but our world, the planet of the 10,000-year stability held within a single degree centigrade average planetary temperature fluctuation annually. What Bill McKibben calls the sweet zone, where civilization evolved. The transition that we find ourselves within, however, is captured by the addition of the term adaptation to mitigation. So the UU statement that called for actions to remedy and mitigate global warming, climate change, would now read to mitigate and adapt to. We can, however, stop running Genesis backwards. We can collectively say, whoa. The transition is a matter of degree, not of an apocalyptic absolute. Indeed, it is a matter of keeping the warming to 2 degrees centigrade. The question of adaptation faces us, as Christian Parenti argues in The Tropic of Chaos, with a new geography of violence unleashed by climate change. It raises, he says, both a technical and a political challenge. The technical adaptation means transforming our relation to nature as nature transforms, learning to live with the damage we have wrought by building seawalls around vulnerable coastal cities, giving land back to mangroves and everglades so they can act to break tidal surges during giant storms, opening wildlife migration corridors so species can move north as the climate warms, and so forth. That highlights the cosmic fold of the cosmopolitical. The other fold is that of political adaptation, which means, in his words, transforming humanity's relationship to itself. This requires new strategies of containing, avoiding, and de-escalating the violence that climate change fuels. For example, across the planet, he writes that extreme weather and water scarcity now inflame and escalate existing social conflicts. Competition over increasingly scarce resources of water and arable land for stressed and growing populations is rapidly intensifying, especially in what he calls the Tropic of Chaos, that violent and impoverished swath of terrain around the mid-latitudes of the planet. What is normally reported as political, tribal, drug, or religious violence is entangled in what he calls a catastrophic convergence with climate change. For instance, violence attributed to Muslim extremism in the Sudan turns out to be motivated primarily by desperation about dwindling water sources and arability. The Swedish government study has recently analyzed 46 countries verging on extreme violence based on climate change. Yet benign adaptation is possible through a multiplication of experiments in local agriculture and cooperation, and of course through global economic redistribution and peacemaking diplomacies working in tandem with ecological resilience. So far, however, another form of political adaptation is underway. Parenti calls it the politics of the armed lifeboat, responding to climate change by arming, excluding, forgetting, repressing, policing, and killing. Picture Noah's Ark fitted with drones, and maybe the goddess Athena at the prow. Yet the age of millions, or excuse me, hundreds of millions of climate migrants has barely begun. As, for instance, they flee the rising seas, the flooding overpopulated coastlines of much of Southeast Asia soon to come, where will they find hospitality? In Soil Not Oil, Vandana Shiva, great anti-globalization activist and physicist, lucidly outlines the extreme disproportion of the social costs for the world's poor of planetary changes already caused by the overconsumption of the wealthy. When such stressed populations fight for their lives and homes, or when they migrate, cut off from their own bit of oikos, are they not again marked as the barbarians, the faceless hordes, enemies of civilization, dirty children of Gaia? Our diverse issues of justice appear densely entangled in the social ecology of the earth. The Christian ethicist Cynthia Moa-Lobito captures this cost not only in terms of class, but also of race privilege. She is now articulating a race debt of climate change. Indeed, she mentions the formative influence on her work of her first professor at Union, who was none other than Professor James Cone. Many of us involved in the practice of any shade of theology are scrambling to adapt our discourse, to find language that does not just repeat facts, that stirs and awakens our divergent constituencies, language that opens the Gaia Complex into the planetary complexity. Well, so how does then theology come to Gaia? And for a lot of us here, that means Protestant theology. I was surprised to find none other than Jürgen Moltmann recently announced the following: the Gaia theory ends the anthropocentrism of the modern world and opens the way to a democratic incorporation of the human species in the whole life, Gesamtleben, of the Earth system. He concludes that until now, the so-called world religions have seen the human world as the universal space for their relevance and expansion. But if that world lives only within the nature of the earth, he argues, then Gaia becomes the universal space for the world religions. This is unexpected language for a theology that has remained faithfully Protestant, indeed Pauline. He has long tied theology to eco-social justice. Now, Moltmann goes even further, in a way that Professor Tatamino may appreciate. The so-called great world religions, he writes, will only prove themselves to be world religions when they become earth religions and understand humanity as an integrated part of the planet Earth. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, earth religions? Such an admonition challenges each of these universalizing traditions, each differently to the core. He is calling for a new earth-human relation as inseparable from a new relation between religions. He writes that when the missionary historical religions reach the ends of the earth, they will have to transform themselves into universal earth religions. For this, the forgotten ecological wisdom and natural reverence of local nature religions will become important again. Well, Christianity has reached the ends of the earth. And along the way, our nomadic missions warped into crusades and colonizations. Its ends into the end. Woe, woe, woe for the unconverted. But in scriptural context, the commission to preach this message to the ends of the earth was neither a warrant for violence nor a prediction of apocalypse. Where Christianity has undergone such a transformation as Moltmann urges, the conversionist pretext of empire dissipates. It might go native. It might preach a subversive cosmopolitics, as Marian Grau has demonstrated so impressively in Rethinking Mission in the Post-Colony. Then perhaps the local earth traditions can come to voice as fresh decolonial wisdom paths beyond tribal self-protection or New Age commodification. Such a planetary commission resembles, it seems to me, Vandana Shiva's call for an earth democracy. In founding the Earth University in India, she invoked the spirit of Gandhi, along with Tagore, as the latter quotes from the ancient texts written in the Forrest, "Know all that moves in this moving world as enveloped by God, and find enjoyment through renunciation, not through greed of possession. No species," she continues, "in a forest appropriates the share of another species. Every species sustains itself in cooperation with others." And what ancient Celt would disagree? 3 decades earlier, Rosemary Radford Ruther had likewise called in God and Gaia for the conversion to the earth. And Ruther has never ceased simultaneously to bring theology into interreligious conversation. Her partners have often been women embodying multiply jeopardized, racialized populations within traditional as well as so-called world religions. Those local wisdoms have, of course, been badly tattered by colonizations, conversions, commodifications, like Gaia. But with these theologians, Gaia, of course, is not identifiable with God, right? The earth would only be a very tiny, if especially complex, organ in the boundless body of the universe. But when I say this, I feel like I'm kind of enshrining the transcendent he-God again, above and beyond the she-body goddess. Don't I subordinate an old earth wisdom to the universalism that deemed it merely pagan? Well, the mysticism of negative theology can help. If God is a nickname for that unknowable, of which there are only creaturely names, Why wouldn't a supreme creature such as a living planet be a most worthy name? How on earth is the earth itself, or Gaia, inclusive of all of us, a less apt God name than the name of some particular earthling, like a father or a king? Gaia would be one noble name, old and now new, for our embodied participation, every body together, in the universe as the body of God, or of the infinite entanglement, just another nickname for God. If Gaia is to be faced rather than feared, it is fortunate that Gaia the theory may be taking hold, and not just in theology. Bruno Latour, the leading continental philosopher of science, has recently, in his Gifford lectures, given her credibility a great transdisciplinary boost. He finds in a multiplicity of engagements, of strategic assemblies of humans and non-humans, the only way to cope with what the multiple loops traced by the instruments of science reveal of the narrative complexity and entanglement of Gaia. The narrative complexity may offer the only cure for the complex. Now, Latour is seeking what he calls a political theology after religion. He writes that it is by facing Gaia, that wholly secularized and earthbound set of processes, that there is a dim possibility that we could let the Spirit renew the face of the earth. Well, the possibility can seem dim indeed. When, for instance, we hear that the Obama-commissioned and long-awaited State Department report clears the way for the Keystone Pipeline, which Hanley has said would mean game over for the planet. The possibility of renewal remains uncertain at best, but uncertainty is not our foe. Even as it beclouds the future, it exposes also our indeterminate interdependence. For instance, ecologically, the separation of the resourced few from the vulnerable rest won't ultimately hold. Adrian Parr, writing of the wrath of capital, succinctly articulates the historic threshold this way: we are poised between needing to radically transform how we live and becoming extinct. That radical transformation is, at least for this window of 15 years or so, possible. But we here might help to slam it shut out of a sense of despair or hopelessness. Understandable hopelessness. And yet to sacrifice hope is to bow to the Olympus of late capitalism. It is to blow off the Spirit. And, you know, when were the possibilities discerned in the prophetic spirit ever more than dim? And in our time, spirited new collaborations between traditionally separated constituencies, between the secular and a religiously earthbound multiplicity, at the same time between the humans and the non-humans, do bode well for a planetary future, destination unknown. And so, in the interest of that narrative complexity and entanglement of Gaia, let me conclude with another story from one of those shamanistic earth traditions that Moltmann calls the world religions to emulate. Tayo is the half-Laguna, half-white protagonist of Leslie Marmon Silko's classic novel, Ceremony. A lot of you read it. Psychically shattered by service in the Pacific theater of World War II, Tayo has finally found healing through shamanistic ritual. Tayo was not crazy, she writes. He had never been crazy. He had only seen and heard the world as it always was. No boundaries, only transitions through all distances and time. His grandfather is the shaman guiding him. But you know, grandson, this world is fragile. The world chosen to express fragile was filled, she writes, with the intricacies of a continuing process and with a strength inherent in spider webs woven across paths through sand hills where early in the morning the sun becomes entangled in each filament of web. Well, did Silkel know of the quantum entanglement of photons through all distances and times? No matter. The visionary precision of the novel brings to light a primordial image of planetary entanglement, the web. Thus the UU statement. As a people of faith, we commit to a renewed reverence for life and respect for the interdependent web of all existence. If the web of the life of the planet is coming unraveled, as surely as was Tayo's psyche, well, we are running Genesis backward, and this is crazy. We are not crazy to grieve and dread the traumatic losses. Indeed, someone should write an application of your president's theology of trauma and grace to the earth of climate change and to the renewing grace of our planetary entanglements. So in that grace, we might imagine the vet Tayo back in touch, bringing to life the petrified Galatian of Pergamon. In this space of no boundaries, only transitions, might Pallas Athena at last listen to her companionate owl and conspire like a wise democratic womanist with the barbarians? Might the Galatians and their cosmopolitan Paul join us in this mindful planetary entanglement, this earth cathedral of many colored windows? And let me then offer a more colorful icon than Pergamon to take with you in transition, closer to the older native shamanistic traditions, not without great trauma, but refusing defeat. Frida Kahlo named this 1949 painting of hers El Abrazo Amorosa. The full version, the love embrace of the universe, the earth, Mexico, me, and Senor Joloto, the dog. See the dog? She doesn't name the central figure who is there in her lap. That's her lover, Diego Rivera, not dead. He has 3 eyes open, whom she is holding in exact mimicry of Michelangelo's Pieta. But the earth is wounded, and the blood drips, but not hopelessly. It's dripping through the nipple as milk. And the wound is echoing Kahlo's own injury to her collarbone. She got age 18 on the bus, which left her disabled for life and provoked her to paint. Gaia might be nicknamed here the earth goddess, Coatlicue, or the Pachamama. A greenish, cloudy soul of the universe enfolds all the embraces. This does not paint all our issues green. But you see in Kahlo's evocation of the pre-Christian and the pre-Hispanic spiritual imaginary, the complex layers, colors, genders of the human, enfolded in the non-human complexity of divinity and of fibrous, tangled vegetation, not to mention of her animal companion, who now lifts his head and barks, "Basta!" That's enough. On with the Pachamama Alliance. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
So we have about 10 minutes here at the end for questions and interactions. Anyone want to launch us into it?
So I'll step into the trial. Of the many things you touched on, I detected a bias against the way corporations are responding to this clean tech or the need to reduce carbon and be more sustainable. But it's actually my experience that those are the biggest supporters, that a lot of companies that have brands that they care about because they're consumers who buy the brands, including Walmart and others, are actually the key to bringing about the change to support protecting the environment, because they really actually have something to lose. They want consumers to buy their products, and that there's been a lot of change that's happening subtly. So I'm wondering, how does this fit with your thesis towards, because we're all in this together, how are we going to get the change to happen?
Well, just very briefly, right, you do detect my bias correctly, but we need all of the allies that we can get, and so I hope you don't detect a kind of purist anti-capitalist position. That would be way too abstract for me. We're densely entangled within the forms of neoliberal economics, which are themselves densely entangled in what we also treasure about democracy. So it's an incredibly ambiguous situation. That's why the ruses of greenwashing, which corporations also take part in very skillfully, are especially insidious. But it's why, when there is support for true environmental shift, we need to on the part of major corporations. Then we need to support it. We need to engage it. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine.
In listening to some of the shamans, one of the things that I've heard is that they believe that the earth is out of balance between feminine energy and masculine energy.
Mm-hmm.
And that one of the critical things to get it in balance is to have to create more space for feminine energy, both of men and women.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what your take on all of that is.
Oh, I'm refreshed to hear that language from you, transmitted from them. And I think we can't lose touch with that dimension. We've just gone through these decades and decades of the women's movements, and the connection of feminism and womanism to ecology and its spiritualities. And there's just been all along so much difficulty in articulating just what is feminine and what is masculine without falling always into, the cultural stereotypes. And the danger is that then we just give it up altogether and forget the profound embodied and spirited histories in which the imbalance that you've described so well has taken place. And we forget that the women's movement, and it's really quite stunning success, and at least as far as any movements for progress have success in human history, this is one of them that has dramatically changed life arrangements across the planet in very few years, proportionately speaking. We can forget that this is a great movement of righting that very imbalance between, traditionally male-identified, traditionally yang energies and forces and those that are traditionally assigned to women. So as soon as we just call them masculine and feminine, we're going to get in trouble within our own context, aren't we? But we can't lose that contact with that language either. Sylvia Marcos, who's a Mexican scholar, has written beautifully about cosmovision, also drawing on Amerindian traditions, and she also insists on recognizing the importance of keeping the alliance of the women's movements in sync with a more indigenous understanding of femininity that has been dangerously at points stifled, exploited, dissipated, repressed, but that also retains some forms of force in these pre-Christian, pre-Hispanic traditions that are important for us. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Keller. Thank you so much for your talk. Kind of come back to the economic question for a moment. One of the most powerful responses I think people have been experiencing and participating has been the divestment movement from fossil fuel divestments and investments. Bill McKibben's group and Green Faith is now starting to do this in relation to religious institutions. So I was wondering if you could speak to the responsibility that institutions have, religious and otherwise, towards divesting from fossil fuels, but also the other part, reinvesting in green technologies.
Well, let me just, say amen. And we went through waves of it, of divestment energy. It drew, 25 years ago. And something was achieved, and then other issues crowded the agenda, and it seems to me we've regressed quite a bit. And and there are always the struggles then under great economic pressure that our institutions have, especially those that are supportive of theological education, often under great economic stress of one kind or another. It is really difficult to make divestment from fossil fuel industries a priority, and it's just such a crucial witness. Thank you.
And for our last question, I'd like to ask John Tatamana to stand and ask it.
So I think that was a magnificent talk, deeply compelling, rich, multi-layered, your usual, in other words. The thing that I'm trying to receive most deeply into myself from what you've said is a kind of call to hope that we are only defeated finally in this project if we fail to hope, and that we are on the verge of it. You speak so poignantly, so accurately about the enormity of the situation that we face and the very peril that we find, that we're on the edge of hopelessness. I just heard this morning about the fact that we're trying to figure out what to do with nuclear waste, which will be with us for hundreds of thousands of years, and no place to put them besides trying to stick it in Gaia.
Right, or shoot it into outer space.
Yeah, so the peril that we face is not just that ecological peril, but the fact that the more sensitive we become to the predicament that we are in, the more likely we are to give up hope. Can you say a bit more about how to walk that fine line?
Right.
How do we cultivate within ourselves the capacities for hope on the very edge of absolute despair. I'd love to hear any wisdom you have on that.
Well, I think we'd all like to hear more of yours. Right. I mean, first of all, we really do, just repeat what you said, need to cultivate it in ourselves. Because I think what isn't working, what won't work is for us to, use a good hope rhetoric with our congregations and our constituencies, because we need hope in order to get action going. That's just not good enough. We have to actually be experiencing its vibrancy, its viriditas, to use old Hildegard's language, its greening power in us. We need to be greened by that hope ourselves, and it's tough, because as you say, the more we learn trying to be conscientious, the more we can get really discouraged. And then there's another sinister fold on this about how to get information out. Someone was just sharing with me the research into just world beliefs. So it seems like a lot of people, a large proportion of the population, have a strong belief in an orderly, stable, just world. You sort of get what you deserve, all that. And information about global warming contradicts that sense of an orderly, stable world. So this population, who might have been getting open to global warming when they realize how bad it is, how it's jeopardizing any possible future, then just simply put their energy into denial and disagreement, because it doesn't fit their worldview. So these authors think we need less dire messaging, less apocalypse. And that's probably exactly right. But again, we can't do that just because it might be more socio-psychologically efficient. My old teacher, John Cobb, said to me once upon a walk, 35 years ago, you just saw him a week ago in the same little town in Claremont. He was already very worried in the 70s about the changing of the climate. He was one of those. And he was saying, well, things are going to have to get a lot worse environmentally before people wake up and change. But he says the hope is that things will get bad enough that a critical mass of people will wake up, and not so bad that it's too late. But I think it's a pretty important hope to work with and to talk about when we are facing the real phenomena of climate change that are scary. Reading them, seeing them on television, experiencing them down the street from us, to remember that it does have to get rather bad before there is a hope of the critical mass of the population waking up. Now, they can come to awareness of it and still not change their views. Like I was delighted to hear that it's now over 50% of Texans, for instance, who think climate change is real and man-made. But I shared this with a student of mine whose family is a farm family from that general vicinity. He said, yeah, my parents now think so too. And they say, Sam, don't worry about it. Jesus is coming again in a generation. This is just more proof of it. So the ruses are complex. But the fact is that the facts will keep happening. The facts aren't going to convert people, but the experience can be interpreted in such a way, I think, as to stir this hope, but never simply by the threat. It's going to be the combination of experiencing that the menace is really dangerous, the wake-up call comes, and just pumping out the images, the stories, like Christina's stories, the narratives, the poems, the metaphors, the paintings, the songs that you have, the sermons that you can preach, the books you can write, the conversations that you can have that will convey this, I think, wondrously hopeful new sense of entangled planetarity, this emerging, coalescing coalition of all of us earthlings, humans and non-humans, across the divide of the secular and the sacred, across the traditional divides of the religion. This is also going on. And this is going on in a time where all of our social justice issues remain vital and tense, but in which we do see the possibility of great change. And if we can bring all these different movements more and more into sync, then we might have the 99%. If we add to it all the non-humans, well, then we've got 99.9999999. I hope. Thank you all.